Oh no. Well, hi there. Last year, I thought for a moment that I had reviewed pretty much all of the skeletons that were out there. I thought that it was going to be the final year of this wonderful and terrible tradition. I just couldn't find many new ones. But after we filmed last year's video, all of the stores started getting in all sorts of terrible skeletons. I've just been looking too early in the year. So I went ahead and got several skeletons last year. Honestly, I have more than I can cover today. I think the future is bright for this dark and dreadful annual event. So let's take a look at what I have. Many were also sent by you guys, and I can tell you that one of them is gonna let me use one of my favorite words. But I'm gonna have to start with this monstrosity. Obviously, I have a lot of these. You guys are so amazing. Seems like every time somebody came into the reptile room, they had a new skeleton snail for me. So here is my collection of terrible Halloween snails. They're the worst, though they do have a few redeeming attributes. And I'll start by saying that this both supports and refutes the ever so popular necromancer hypothesis for these skeletons. I think that this is obvious, but snails do not have internal skeletons. And unlike many of the arthropods that we've seen in the past, they don't have an exoskeleton either, though they do have a shell. Like the octopuses that we have looked at over the last couple of years, snails are mollusks. So the closest thing that they have to a hard skeleton of any kind is their shell, secreted by the mantle, and their hydrostatic skeleton, which is rigidity derived from fluid pressure filling a compartment in the animal, not from hardened structures like we see, well, here. So once a snail dies and its soft tissues decay, generally all that is left is the shell, which is an asymmetrical spiral. And you see that here, though the shell does appear to have a human face, which is cool, but obviously not found on real snail shells. And it's the thing that somewhat undermines the necromancer hypothesis. Where is a necromancer going to find a skull with a right-handed whorl, or a shell with a skull face? And they join together too seamlessly to be any sort of an amalgamation. But I do want to point out that the right-handed whorl is very accurate. The vast majority of snails whirl this way. So these two snail shells, for example, are both right-handed snail shells, which again is the very, very common form. And it has to do with if the point of the shell is up, which of your hands you could insert into the opening and have it curve along the curvature of the shell. So this one I could reach in with my right hand, but if I flipped it this way so that opening is there, my left hand wouldn't go into it. It could go in, but it doesn't curve the right direction. And so this is a right-handed snail shell, as is this one. So if I take the point and put it up, I can curve my hand easily, my right hand into the whorl, but my left hand doesn't go into it. That makes this a right-handed snail shell, and this is a right-handed snail shell. So most snails are right-handed, which is very beneficial when it comes to mating. But interestingly, many snail-eating snakes have asymmetrical jaws to assist in the removal of right-handed snails from their shells. And in places where such snakes are common, the proportion of left-handed snails is often higher. I think it's pretty clear by now that these skeletons are, in general, anything but brilliant. However, the sponsor of today's video is Brilliant. Brilliant is an interactive learning platform that teaches you math, programming, data analysis, and more through hands-on problem solving. Unlike traditional lectures, Brilliant makes learning active, engaging, and fun. Their first principles approach helps you build knowledge from the ground up by letting you experiment with real-world concepts in a way that's proven to be more effective than just watching videos. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Whether you're solving algebra problems, exploring data science, or learning how to code, you'll be developing critical problem-solving skills along the way. And the best part? Brilliant fits into your life. You can learn in minutes a day, anywhere, right from your phone. It's a powerful daily habit that helps you grow as a thinker. And the reality is, in my experience, when you do something that's really intense but isn't something that you can keep up long term, you don't really make a change in your life. But when you've got something like this that you can do in just a few minutes a day, something that doesn't totally force you to adopt an entirely new way of living, That's where the big and lasting changes come from. Try Brilliant for free for 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/Clint or by scanning the QR code on your screen and get 20% off an annual premium subscription. It's a smarter way to learn. So anyway, that covers the shell. But that's not the only inappropriate face that this has, because it also has this one. Here on its head, between the tentacles and the eye stalks, is a pretty clear skeletal face. 2 orbits and a nasal cavity. And the thing is that snails have eyes and the equivalent of a nose. That's just not where they are. These right here are the eyes at the ends of the eye stalks, which are actually tentacles called omatophores. As for the nose, it's not even on the head. The breathing hole, called the pneumostome, is about right here and leads into the mantle cavity where the lungs are located. So the breathing hole, again, is right there, but that isn't where they do their smelling. They smell with this lower pair of tentacles. So their smelling is right here. So why it has a second nose and extra eyes, that's beyond me. Anyway, the shell is fine, except it has a face on it. And the head is fine, except it has a face on it. And part of the foot, which is this whole part here, it's fine too. If you just saw this snail from the back, it looked like an anatomically pretty good model of a snail. But from the front, it's a total train wreck. It's like a reverse mullet. Business in the back, bones and faces that it doesn't have in the front. So the top of this foot looks like a vertebrate skeleton with osteoderms, like you'd find on a crocodile. And then ribs poking out of the side. Yikes. It's a train wreck, but maybe not the worst train wreck of the day. Please tell me which one you thought was the worst train wreck down in the comments. But anyway, let's take a look at another skeleton that I have more than one of. This duck! And we'll look at this duck too, just to get all of our ducks in a row. So these are just dreadful, but in surprisingly different ways, which just goes to show that there's more than one way to mess up a duck. I think maybe I'll start with the teeth. This one has teeth. Toothed birds like this went extinct 66 million years ago. And even when they did exist, I doubt they had central teeth. So that's weird. But just to be fair, mergansers and many of the other anseriforms do have serrated bills that look a bit like teeth, even though they're not. So maybe this is some sort of wide-billed merganser. But this duck skull, it's honestly fantastic. That isn't to say that the whole duck is, because in some ways it's worse than this one. But this head, it looks great. This little space right here, that alone is enough to tell me that this artist, at some point, looked at an actual duck skull. And that is so much more than I can say for the vast majority of these skeletons. Also, the feet, ignoring the bone webbing, they're pretty accurate. They don't look like skeletal feet, but they do look like duck feet. 3 webbed front-facing toes and 1 unwebbed hallux coming out the rear. And the good doesn't end there. The basic shape of this duck, it's pretty accurate. This neck is a little bit short. Birds almost always have much longer necks than you'd think, but it's otherwise a very reasonable representation of a duck neck. This right here is honestly one of the best parts of the whole skeleton. This is a furcula, a fused clavicle. And the duck furcula does look very much like this, because this artist has seen a duck skeleton before. And this pelvis is not bad. I mean, for one thing, this duck has a pelvis. This one's not so lucky. And this is pretty much the right shape. It does appear to have some ribs coming out of it, which pelvises do not have, but the pubis bone in ducks does protrude out a bit like this, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that this is what they were attempting to make. I guess what I'm saying is that this duck is pretty amazing in many ways. This artist has clearly seen a duck skeleton before, which in some ways makes a few of the structures even more outrageous than they would otherwise be. While so much of this is right, basically everything associated with flight is either wrong or missing. I'll start with the wings. Bird wings are almost always an outrage with these skeletons, and this is no exception. Things start out okay. I mean, here's the scapula, here's the humerus, and at this point right here, we should have two bones, the radius and the ulna, but instead we get a single bone radio-ulna. Not the last one we'll see today, though at least one will actually be on an animal that actually has a radio-ulna, but ducks do not. But that's not the worst part of the wing. This is. In birds, carpal and metacarpal bones are fused into a structure called a carpometacarpus, which doesn't look much like this. And while it does have 3 reduced fingers attached to it, they don't look like big old bone feathers. One comes off the end, sort of like this one, but one comes off more in the thumb position, and one that's just very tiny comes off from kind of down here. They do not look like bone feathers. So I don't know how the same artist that created so many good duck features produced this terrible wing. Though it is better than this monstrosity, where we've got a scapula, we got a humerus, we got a tiny radio-ulna, and then these giant fingers. No sign of a carpometacarpus at all, unless this is it, in which case it has no humerus at all. Plus it has ribs all the way to its tail. Which gets me to the 2 things about this duck that are clearly better than this duck. First, this duck has a tiny little fused tail, and just one of them, like almost every other vertebrate to ever live on this planet. On real ducks, this single tail, called a pygostyle, is a bit longer, but there's just one of them. Not 3! This duck has 3 tails! A trigostyle! Not the most tails that we'll see today, but way too many tails. That might be the worst feature on this duck, but it does have a rival. The ribs of this duck are connected by a sternum. Real ducks have a sternum as well, but this duck does not. No sternum. Which is bad enough, but ducks don't just have sternums, they have gigantic keeled sternums that provide massive amounts of surface area for their flight muscles to attach. Both the muscles that pull the wing down and those used to raise it back up. But this duck, no sternum at all. But good news, this deep sea anglerfish has a sternum. Bad news though, ray fin fishes do not have sternums. But it gets worse because anglerfishes do not even have ribs. They eat really huge meals with their giant mouths, which are actually, in many cases, considerably larger than this one. Anyway, anglerfishes eat huge meals, and ribs would be a problem, just like they would be for pufferfishes. The good thing is that neither of those fishes have ribs. This one does, though. And like puffers, and likely for very similar reasons, anglerfishes also lack pelvic fins. Real anglerfishes will have an anal fin, and this one does not. This dorsal fin back here, it actually looks pretty good, and they often have one that is located far back like this, so that's not too bad. The other 2 fins, this caudal fin and these pectoral fins, are in the right spots, though they do seem to have a lot of large finger bones, sort of like a whale, except also in the caudal fin, which whales don't have. And that is instead of the fin rays that would actually be present in ray fin fishes. And this is also something that I've noticed about anglerfishes specifically. So this is the spine right here. And in actual anglerfishes, that spine attaches very high up on the skull, not down here like on this one. But I would be remiss if I didn't spend a moment talking about this structure. This lighted lure called the elysium. It's a modified spine from their dorsal fin that has shifted forward on their face, often all the way up to basically the edge of the mouth. They have 5 pairs of muscles that move it up and down in order to lure prey. Many, such as this one, have a luminescent organ at the end of the elysium called an esca. The illumination is caused by symbiotic bacteria that are housed around the esca. The bacteria are so specialized to living in an anglerfish around the esca that they have never been found anywhere else. And many have experienced reductions in their own genomes, making it so that they can't even illuminate themselves outside of an anglerfish. Which means that they've become dependent on the anglerfish's nuclear genome for some of the products necessary to perform their primary function. And I should mention that this is a female anglerfish. And I know that for reasons that we explained in this video. So we've now looked at the sternumless skeleton of an animal with a huge sternum and a sternum-possessing skeleton of an animal with no sternum or ribs. But this is a skeleton with a sternum of an animal that has a sternum. They also have bones between the sternum and the pelvis called gastralia, which aren't present here, but I'm still dang happy with this. This is an animal with a sternum that has a sternum. You have to celebrate the wins. And articulated skeletons of dinosaurs that had gastralia in museums, they don't always have them. I might go as far as to say that they usually don't have them. So, this is a win. But the wins don't end there. This appears to be an alligator. It even says that it's an alligator on the tag. And all of the teeth on the bottom jaw have sockets in the top jaw, or at least are not visible when the mouth is closed. The skull is a touch tall for a modern crocodilian. They're more dorsoventrally compressed. And the skull is a bit short, because it just kind of ends after the eye. Thus the ears and brain case are missing. But the lower jaw does show the mandibular fenestra, which sends the message that the artist may have looked at an actual crocodilian skull at some point. Though with the back of the skull missing, and seemingly covered in mummified skin, there is no evidence of the superior or inferior temporal fenestrae, characteristic of diapsids. And it's just as well that the brain case is missing, as the spine seems to attach at the back of the lower jaw, so the brain wouldn't be connected to the rest of the nervous system, even if it has one. This right here is where the spine actually attaches, and this little knob right here is called an occipital condyle. It's where the skull articulates with the first cervical vertebrae. Crocodilians and other reptiles such as birds just have one occipital condyle, whereas amphibians and synapsids like mammals have two. Of course, we can't see if this guy has one because of all the mummy skin, which is also present here on the vertebrae, as well as the scapulae, the pelvis, and the femora, and also on the bottom jaw, but not on other parts of the legs or the ribs. While we're talking about legs, these aren't terrible. I think there was some attempt made at a radius and ulna, as well as a tibia and fibula, though the back feet do have too many toes on them. There should only be 4 on each back foot. There's no sign of bone webbing, which actually, given all of this mummified skin, might actually be justifiable on this skeleton. As for this pelvis, it's not bad. In actual crocodilians, it does sort of hang down below the vertebrae like this, and the pubis bones do look a little bit like this from the side, though they do curve towards one another. They don't just come out straight like this. But I still think this is an evidence that this artist may have looked at an actual skeleton. This tail it's too short, and it lacks the large spines present on actual crocodilians. And I don't know what this spear point is supposed to be, but it's got one. These are some odd choices, but not the worst we've ever seen. I would argue that it's better than last year's crocodilian. Let's pause for just a second to look at this skeleton pumpkin before we move on to this terrifying rabbit. It's a skeleton pumpkin! And obviously, pumpkins do not have internal vertebrate-style skeletons. But I see nothing about this that's all that unrealistic. You wouldn't need to be a necromancer to make one. Just a weirdo with an interest in the macabre. With a couple of vertebrae, some ribs, and a pile of metacarpals, metatarsals, and phalanges. And if you are such a person, can I please interest you in becoming an artist that makes some better Halloween skeletons? I mean, look at this rabbit. I don't know where to start.
Look at the bones!
Alright, I will. They're terrible. I'll start with the skull. And let's ignore the bone ears. Honestly, if this didn't have bone ears and a bone cottontail, I wouldn't have any idea what this monstrosity was supposed to be. Looking at the legs and the way that the tail moves, I would guess that this is normally a dog skeleton. I don't know what that sound is, though it does sound a bit like a screaming rabbit.
Yeah. It's okay.
We have a ton of freaky moving and screaming skeletons this year. I'll be sure to show you all of their terrifying abilities at the end. But this is a real rabbit skull. This looks more like a hairless rabbit mummy than a skeleton. But these teeth are interesting. I will give them credit. Rabbits only have incisors and cheek teeth. And this only has incisors and cheek teeth. But they do have incisors and cheek teeth on both the top and bottom jaws. Not incisors or cheek teeth on the top and bottom jaws. This guy's like a reverse cow. He has incisors on the top and nothing on the bottom. But instead of a diastema after those incisors, well, what we have is an unending diastema. There are no more teeth. The bottom jaw does get some cheek teeth. Not many for a lagomorph, but it does get some. Nothing else about this skull is particularly accurate or remarkably inaccurate. And so I guess we'll just move on to the body. Nothing about this body is shockingly good. I do think it probably has a sternum. It has very few lumbar vertebrae, but it does have some. But true rabbits have lots. Rabbits at rest are plantigrade, meaning that they put their entire foot on the ground like you do. So that's accurate. But this is the shortest rabbit foot I have ever seen. Though the toe count is right, at least on the back feet. The front feet of rabbits do have 5 toes, but the dew claw sits kind of right up about here. And so I wouldn't expect to see it on this particular rabbit, given that the legs are hollow. But it is these leg bones that really get me. It has like a pelvis, a femur, looks like a tibiofibula. That's fine. In rabbits, they do have a distinct tibia and fibula, but whatever. Up here, we've got a radioulna. They have a radius and ulna, but whatever. Then there's a humerus, right? Fairly normal. There's a scapula. But what is this? What is this bone? It's just a bonus leg bone and an extra joint. All right. So obviously you guys help out a ton by finding and sending skeletons, but I also spend a considerable amount of money each year on skeletons. And so if you want to see this tradition continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon. In that way, even if you don't send one personally, you're kind of sending us a skeleton and keeping this tradition alive. All right. Let's look at this turtle. And here is the question. Is it better or worse than the rabbit? And I guess I'll start with the skull. It's another mummy skull. So in that way, it's no worse than the rabbit. But these teeth are worse because it has teeth. We haven't had any sort of a toothed turtle in the last 160 or so million years. So if you went back in time to when T-Rex was alive, and then went back that much time again, so twice as long ago as T-Rex, you still wouldn't have any toothed turtles. And the youngest fossils of toothed turtles would at that time still have been more than 20 million years old. So this isn't what you would call a modern turtle. It has no detail on the skull or neck because this is a mummy, though I do appreciate that it stole its tail from a rattlesnake. The upper shell, the carapace, really looks pretty good for a tortoise. You can tell it's a tortoise because it doesn't appear to be shedding the scutes as it grows. But the fact that it's plantigrade, like a rabbit, and not digitigrade, standing on its toes, like a tortoise, suggests that it's not a tortoise. And we have yet another tibiofibula and radioulna on an animal that has neither of those things. Turtles, in fact, often have a rather dramatic space between their radius and ulna and tibia and fibula. Not here. So fusing those bones, it seems like a real theme this year. And if I had to nail down another theme, it would be inappropriate sternums. And this turtle did not disappoint. So the ribs are a significant part of the bone structure that forms the carapace of turtles. The plastron, the bottom shell, is made up of the clavicle bones, which are these, the gastralia that we discussed when talking about the alligator, and possibly the sternum. However, the sternum is so unrecognizable that it's difficult for scientists to determine if the sternum is actually part of the structure or not. So you can't just turn over a turtle, even a skeletal turtle, and expect to see ribs or an identifiable sternum, unless it's this turtle, which clearly gives our rabbit a run for its money. But at least turtles have ribs and probably a sternum. Because frogs don't. But this one does. So many ribs, all the way to the end of its body. This rib cage and pelvis are so solid that I'm confident that all waste products are gonna have to go out the same way they came in. But being the year for inappropriate sternums, I shouldn't be too shocked. And how did they do with the other theme for the year? You know, fusing the radius and ulna and the tibia and fibula? Well, they did perfectly. And not perfectly bad, perfectly perfect. This frog seems to have both a radioulna and a tibiofibula, but unlike the many other examples of these structures that we've seen this year, frogs actually have both of those things. If it weren't for the lack of the very conspicuous tarsal bones, as well as the less conspicuous carpal bones, and of course the presence of bone webbing, I'd be pretty happy with these legs. They even got the number of toes right. The feet and head appear to be mummified, which might be a third theme of the year. But assuming that they are mummy feet and a mummy head, really looks pretty decent. If this body even resembled the actual skeletal body of a frog in the tiniest degree, this would be one of the better skeletons of the year. But the actual frog pelvis on real frogs makes up about half of the length of its torso, with the rest being a relatively short spinal column with spines, but again, no ribs at all. And with that, I think I'll show you one of my favorite skeletons of the whole year. But not my favorite one. I'm saving that one for last. So this might be the worst skeleton that we've had, which is saying a lot. But based on the head of this creature, I would say that it's supposed to be a pterosaur, specifically a pteranodon, which, surprisingly to many people, is not a dinosaur. Though much of the anatomy of this particular pteranodon looks more like a dinosaur than it does like a pteranodon. And the thing is that there isn't much excuse for getting the skeletal anatomy of Mesozoic animals this kind of wrong. With many of these animals, I suspect that the artists have never seen their skeletons before, or are making them for people who've never seen their skeletons before, and therefore are making their models based on what these animals look like on the outside. But in cases like this, almost everything that we know about them has come from the study of their skeletons. So this monstrosity is, in my assessment, inexcusable. So I think I'll start by walking you through what it is, and then we'll talk about what it should be. So I've based my assessment that it's supposed to be a pteranodon off of the basic shape of this head, though not the specific anatomy thereof. The long beak and crest off the back suggest pteranodon, though I would actually prefer to think that this is a terrible stork with a horrible bony growth off the back of its skull. After the head, we run into a very short neck with 3 vertebrae. I usually don't count vertebrae because it's like these aren't anatomical models, but this is a very short neck. 3. Just 3. Even you have more than twice this many, and you don't have as many as a pterosaur, but whatever. The spine continues, and we do have both thoracic and lumbar vertebrae. We have ribs and a sternum, not too shabby. The sternum even has a keel, which almost none, maybe literally none, of the bird skeletons that we've ever examined possessed. So we have a keeled sternum. I'm not quite sure what this is right here. It almost looks like a furcula, but it is fused to the sternum, so anyway, I'm not quite sure. It could just be a really weird rib. There is no scapula, but the wings do seem to grow kind of out of the vertebrae, which is interesting. So, okay, here's the humerus. Then we've got a radioulna, which is very appropriate this year. The joint between the two seems to have a patella, which I don't think any animals have ever had. I could be wrong, but an elbow cap, that's a new one for me. But don't worry, we're not done, because we have another patella right here at the wrist. Maybe it's a carpal bone. Maybe, best case scenario. And then we have one gigantic hand bone that continues all the way to the end of the wing and branches twice. 2 of the branches, actually branches into 3, and 2 of the 3 branches get their own fingers. So that's the wing. All right, let's go back to the end of the spine, because we ended at the end of the lumbar vertebrae. I just want to point out real quick that vertebrae are cervical, thoracic, and then lumbar. CTL, which are my initials. And that's always helped me. But after the lumbar vertebrae, you usually get another C, caudal. tail bones. And while this guy only seems to have 2 caudal bones per tail, it has 8 caudal bones. Because it has more tails than Tauros. This pelvis isn't so bad, though the way that the femora grow out of it is interesting. Not to mention the way that they fuse together. Not sure how that works. So here's the patella on an actual knee. And then we get a tibiofibula. No ankle cap though, so that's a little better. Then we get 1 long tarsometatarsus, like a proper bird, and then toes. 3 in front and a hallux out back. Ansiodactyl. So that's what it is. Now for what it should be. I'll start with the head. The basic shape is okay, though the beak should have kind of a slightly upturned profile. Pteranodons, though, were toothless, so that is accurate. Instead of this tiny nares, though, it should have a huge hole where the nares and antorbital fenestra, like what you see in most dinosaurs, are connected. And this orbit is considerably too big and for some reason shaped like a human eyelid. But whatever. I already addressed the neck. There should technically be about 9 vertebrae, but I wouldn't expect that exact number. Just 3 seems far too short. Though the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae and rib cage are all not bad enough to have gotten my attention at all, which is not too shabby. And though this keel is a bit big, they did indeed have a keeled sternum. So in this way, this is a better skeleton than any of the birds that we've ever seen over these many years. And this whole phenomenon began with a bird, so things are looking up. There should be a scapula. This vertebral wing anchor should not exist. As for the rest of the wing, there are, in this world, excusable mistakes. There are egregious insults to anatomy. And then there's this. Okay, so we got a humerus. It's a bit long, but what are you going to do? There is, of course, no elbow cap. They have a separate radius and ulna, so not this. And after that, the actual pterosaur wing becomes so darn cool. Because in a real pterosaur wing, the humerus, radius, and ulna, which make up the vast majority of the length of your arm, only make up a small fraction of the length of the wing. The word pterodactyl means wing finger, though even the finger is only part of the story, because they also have extremely long hands. And that is oftentimes omitted even from pretty good models of pterosaurs. Oftentimes you see the 3-clawed fingers come out at the articulation between the forearm and the rest of the wing, which is the wrist. But that's not where they're actually located. I would say that most pterosaur models get that wrong. So this is a Schleich or whatever model. I don't know how you say this word, but these guys make pretty good models, and even they get it wrong. I mean, look at the antorbital fenestra. That's pretty great. And the slightly upturned beak. The long neck. It even has 3 fingers. They're just not in the right position. But at least it has them. This might be the first model that I've ever seen that doesn't have those fingers at all. But where those fingers actually go is right here. This model was sent to me by Steve from Paleoanalysis. And it is a life-sized replica of the smallest pterosaur that we know to have existed, Nemicolopterus. But what you can see is that after the radius and ulna, after the wrist, there is another long bone before the fingers. And also this little spike. This spike is the pteroid bone that helped in some way to support and manipulate the wing membrane. And this long bone, the one that is very often omitted in pterosaur models, including this one, is a giant metacarpal, a giant hand bone. So this is part of the hand, and the fingers come off of the end of the hand, as fingers often do. But you'll notice that there's still a lot of wing left to go. And that is yet another finger. We've accounted for these 3 fingers. But this one, the ring finger, is very long. Hence the name wing finger. So that is the pterosaur wing. A very different structure from what we see in other flying vertebrates, such as bats or dinosaurs. And very different from this, which is not like any wing that has ever existed on this planet. Of course, that's also true for the tails. I don't think we've ever seen a 4-tailed vertebrate species, though the tail of Pteranodon was fairly short like this. As for these legs, I'll start by saying that Pteranodon didn't stand like this. Now that we've found pterosaur trackways, we know that they walked on all 4s. They also had a tibia and a fibula, and this is not enough toes. Pterosaurs had 5 toes with 4 of them pointing forward. Something that this model actually got wrong too. But again, this does have a keel, so it's not all bad. If you'd like to see a full video on pterosaurs soon, be sure to let me know down in the comments. But I want to end with my favorite skeleton of the year. This thing is the worst, and it's wonderful. It's a vertebrate centipede. So just to be clear, centipedes are not vertebrates. They aren't even butt-first bagels. They're arthropods, which means that their skeleton is
On the outside.
a centipede skeleton. Looks like a centipede. So it's the worst. Centipedes, unlike their cousins millipedes, only have 1 pair of legs per segment, which seems to be the case with this one, though the placement of the legs under the body is very millipedish. It has 1 pair of antennae, which is accurate, and the rear set of legs stick out the back, so that's all very accurate. But if you know me well, you already know why I love this thing. It has toxicognaths, also known as forcipules, venom-injecting forelegs. So given that this is a vertebrate skeleton in the form of a centipede, I suppose if there was ever going to be a human centipede, it would probably look like this. I did mention a few years ago that I have a friend that was in Human Centipede, and it's actually a friend that you may know. So if you have any guesses about who that might be, feel free to throw them into the comments. I'd love to see. And as bad as this skeleton is overall, I can't hate anything that gives me an excuse to say the word toxicognath! And you know what? We'll make next week's video all about them. A full-on celebration of hypodermic forelegs. A true triumph for toxicognaths. And if you want the perfect shirt to wear for this toxicognath celebration, we'll have one for you down in the description. Happy Halloween! Should we do this again next year? If so, please send skeletons now. We'll have our address down in the description. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. Let me try one more time.
I never noticed the tail. Oh my god.